QSO Today, episode 284, Michael Murphy, WU2D. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you that in this new year they have just the right rig for DXers, contesters, and rag chewers. And by QRP Labs, makers of the popular QCX kit transceiver and a whole host of kits and parts for the radio amateur builder. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. My QSO today is with Mike Murphy, WU2D, who separates his professional and his personal radio and electronics life by building, using, and working with vintage radios made no later than the early 1960s. As a collector and builder of old-time and military surplus radios, Mike is convinced that the magic of radio is at the fingertips of any operator who has a love and fascination for this early equipment. Mike is a prolific writer and contributor to Electric Radio Magazine, QST, and many vintage radio forums. I came away with a new perspective, and I know that you will too after listening to this QSO Today. WU2D, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Mike?
4Z1UG, this is WU2D. I have you 5x5.
Mike, thanks so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, I was surrounded by radios. It's kind of funny because I had a cousin that was a radio repairman, and he had this habit of dropping off carcasses of transistor and tube type radios. The next door neighbor woman that actually watched many of the kids in the neighborhood because my mom worked, and many of the moms worked in town, her husband happened to be a very active ham. And, so I was kind of surrounded that way. And then some of the friends I had, the parents worked up at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York. And one of my best friends' dad was actually the physics professor. So they would sometimes invite the kids up to the lab. And, of course, there was radio. It was a radio lab. And so I was kind of surrounded by people that were playing with radios, radios as a profession, and some really good hams. So I kind of had to become interested in radio at a fairly early age. I would say I had my first experiences in radios in the late 60s as an 11 and a 12-year-old building crystal sets and reading about radio projects in the boys' first book of radio and electronics and so on, Eric.
So that was Alfred Morgan, right?
Yeah, Alfred Morgan had a series of books. He wrote on many subjects, and we happened to have in the library pretty much his full set of radio books.
Well, those were my favorites as well at that time. What was the hometown?
Hometown is Canton, New York. Canton and Potsdam are located in northern New York, north of Lake Placid and just south of the St. Lawrence River. It's home of St. Lawrence University and Clarkson College. You might have heard of them.
I have, in fact. Were there other large industries up there? Were there a lot of engineers that happened to be in the area at the time?
Absolutely not. This is a very isolated community, and in fact it was so isolated we couldn't pick up very many TV stations. And some of them were in French, in fact, that you could pick up. So as a very young person, I was exposed to satellite cable. And this is a cable network which had a few channels, and it was distributed around the town. So we were kind of brought into the modern world through cable TV in 1967.
Right. Those were called classic cable systems. They were far enough away from a major city that you needed them in order to see the off-the-air signals, right?
That's exactly right. And before that existed, we had to use very high-gain Yagi antennas in order to get each channel. So you would have, say, a Cut 5 or a Cut 7 Yagi that you would get from your local TV shop. And you would put these Yagis and point them in different directions right at the stations, and then they were combined and brought down to your TV.
Do you remember the name or the call sign of the neighbor that lived next door?
Yes, it was Ed Kręcewski, a big Polish guy, and he was a professional technician at one of the colleges in town. We had a SUNY, a State University of New York college, also in town. So we were heavy on colleges, light on engineering jobs, I guess. And he had this job of keeping all the electronics in the college running. And this is a guy that knew how to build things. He knew how to solder. He would put together a complete Heathkit Indian station, and you would swear it was professionally soldered. That's how good he was. He was my Elmer that got me started in ham radio. He gave myself and my two buddies our novice tests with the 5 words per minute with the CW. And Ed was a funny guy. NR2B was his later call when he got his extra. Ed actually was one of the big members in the New York State Phone Traffic and Emergency Net, which is a 75-meter single sideband net that was very popular with traffic handling in the 60s and 70s. And Ed had his shack located in the den just around the reach of the kitchen. So when he would get on to run the net at night, say at 6 o'clock, his wife would literally hand a plate of food around the corner to him.
What year did he give you your novice license?
It was around 1973 that the three of us, we were all similar age. Bill Ash, who was my age, and Dwayne Cady, who was maybe a year or two younger than us. All three of us got our novice licenses in 73.
How long were you a novice?
At that time, the novice lasted for 2 years, and we had just switched over to being able to use VFO control. So you could literally buy an Apache or a ARC-V command set and use it as is. You didn't have to use crystal control.
Okay, so you were a novice for a year or two. What was your first rig? What was your novice rig?
Ed was all about appliance operation. He had a complete Helicrafters station, and then a Heathkit Indian station with the Mohawk, the Marauder, and the Warrior amplifier. And later on, he got into the Galaxy 550 and other transceivers and so on. Most of the old guys in town that were in the club ran transceivers and are what I would consider to be, modern hams. They were members of the ARRL. They were trying to go after the technology of the time. For some reason, I rebelled against all of that, and it was just natural. I had no interest in modern single sideband, and was very interested in CW and in military surplus. Somebody had dropped off a World War II receiver long before I was a ham. I liked the look of it. I liked the feel of it. And I got sucked into the surplus in the building craze, and I shied away from commercial equipment. So my first radios were an ARC-V transmitter for 80 meters and a homemade 6DQ6 oscillator right out of the ARRL handbook, 1962, using a TV sweep tube. And I built the power supplies myself, received some pretty nasty shocks, and had some big surprises because I was only a 14 or 15, 16-year-old when I was doing this high-voltage work, and, mistakes can be made, Eric.
Right, of course. And what was the receiver?
The receiver was a Sherman tank receiver. The first receiver I got was a BC-652 tank receiver, and the second receiver that I had was a shortwave receiver that my parents bought for me from Sears, which I hated. It was a plastic thing. And then I convinced them by 1970, and this is before I had my ticket, to buy me a realistic DX150 from Radio Shack. Radio Shack was a big, important part of my early hamming because they had parts And the DX150 was a wonderful receiver for a novice. It was solid state, and it kind of went against my idea of home building and surplus. But boy, it really got me on the air, helped me to use my homemade oscillator on 15 meters, for instance. I never could have built anything to receive 15 meters.
How long did you operate that rig before you upgraded?
Well, I would say throughout high school, I continued to use surplus equipment, and eventually I got myself a Marauder, a hand-down Heathkit Marauder, which is a very large CW and single sideband transmitter. It's a boat anchor. I still own one. It still works. And so the Marauder, together with the realistic DX150, gave me CW and single sideband capability, and I, of course, wanted to upgrade to get my general and my advanced class. And both Dwayne and I, Dwayne, by the way, was WN2VJB, and then, of course, he became KK4DDT and lived in Georgia for his years after the Air Force, and we continued, in contact through the years. But Dwayne, he also got an ARC-V transmitter, but he was lucky enough to be deeded a BC348 receiver, which was a much more sophisticated receiver than my simple tank receiver that only handled 80 meters. Again, the surplus stuff was available then, and it was being passed down. My other best friend, Billy Ash, WN1IAP, his dad was the one that was the physics professor. He was given by his Elmer a complete station, a DX40 with an HR10B that I was drooling over when I saw that station. And we all had our tickets coming at the same time, but Billy's ticket showed up. And he said, come over, you got to see this. So we went over, and he allowed me to use his call and make a contact on his DX40. And I was so excited. I had received the ARC-V transmitter, my first transmitter, and I had the tank receiver at that time. And I didn't have my license yet, but it was coming in the mail. And I thought, gee, I'd like to try to make a contact. Maybe I can use Billy's, I can just make one contact just to see if my station works, And, of course, when you're looking at the handbook, the ARRL handbook had a lot of antenna projects. And really all I needed to do was put up a long wire. The ARC-V would load into anything, right? It has that roller inductor. But instead, I picked the most crazy antenna they had in the book, a helical antenna wound on a fiberglass pole. And, of course, we didn't have a fiberglass pole, but we could get a bamboo pole from the hardware store. So I wound about 200 feet of number 14 wire on a bamboo pole and strapped it to the chimney and then brought the lead down to the ARC-V. So when I fired up the ARC-V just to test it into a light bulb, all was well. But when I hooked it up to that antenna, my father screamed, "The lights are coming on down here. What's going on?" I was putting more energy into the house than I was into the air. So that's when I decided I needed to have a ground rod. So I made a ground rod, brought the number 10 wire up to the shack.
Now, were you on the main floor or were you on the second floor?
I was on the second floor. It was the ground wire that was the antenna. I was literally driving the RF down into the ground wire in kind of a Marconi fashion. I'll call it a Tesla generator that I had on the roof wasn't doing much. But so anyway, I said, I'm going to make this contact and see if this ARC-V works. And I'll just borrow Billy's call. So I call out, WN1IAP, CQ. A station comes back, first call. And this was right after school. This was like, 3:30 in the afternoon, you're out of school, and I'm doing this terrible thing, borrowing my friend's call, and I get a call from a VE2. Not only am I bootlegging, I'm transmitting without a license. My first call gets answered, and it's an international station.
On 80 meters, no less.
On 80 meters, in the middle of the day.
And now this message from ICOM America. It's a new year and a New Year's of savings at ICOM. Bring in the new year loud and clear with some of ICOM's most innovative and interesting transceivers. Start off the new year with a high-performance ICOM IC7610. This direct sampling HF transceiver changes the world's definition of SDR or software-defined radio. It has the ability to pick up the faintest of signals even in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. Its features include RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receiver, and dual digicell. The ICOM IC7300 changes the way entry-level HF transceivers are designed. Even at its amazing price point, the IC7300 is an innovative SDR transceiver with a beautifully compact design and form factor. It is the HF transceiver now in my shack and has changed my appreciation of what is even possible in the HF bands. Features include RF direct sampling system, 15 discrete bandpass filters, a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. Finally, the ICOM IC9700 was designed and is built with the VHF-UHF weak signal operator in mind, with faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. The ICOM IC9700 is the pinnacle of perfection for all-mode VHF-UHF and 1.2 GHz transceiver. If your New Year's resolution includes operating moon bounce or meteor scatter, then the IC9700 is for you. Features include a 4.3-inch color touchscreen, dual watch operation and full duplex operation in the satellite mode, real-time high-speed spectrum scope and waterfall display, voice recording playback function in an SD memory card, and it supports CW, AM, single sideband, FM, RTTY. So it's a new year, and if Santa didn't bring one of these fine ICOM rigs, now is the time to get it yourself. So bring in the new year loud and clear with some of ICOM's most innovative products. Check out ICOM's website for current promotions on the ICOM IC7610, 7300, and 9700 by clicking on the ICOM banner on this week's show notes page. And when you buy that new ICOM rig, please be sure to tell the dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO.
So all was well. The license came immediately. I had it within 3 days. This was all forgotten. We were all excited about our new stations. And all of a sudden, Billy says on the phone, "You got to get over here, Mike. You got to get over here now." So I went over to his house, and the Ash household was extremely strict and conservative. This is a German-American household. My household, on the other hand, was very liberal. I was an only child. I was spoiled. I was adopted. My parents never touched me, you know. I got pretty much anything I wanted as a kid. I was totally spoiled. Billy, on the other hand, he had a brother and a sister, and this was a strict family. Well, that guy up in Quebec sent a QSL card. And, of course, the QSL card said, "To Mike, a great new operator." And, of course, Mike is not the same as Billy, and the father went berserk. And I had sinned. Not only was the FCC going to come after me, the entire German whatever. I was a bad, bad boy, okay? And I knew it. So that was my my first bootleg.
That was the first and last bootleg.
First and last bootleg, let me tell you. So, you know, through the years when you're using homemade equipment, and I was using a lot of 1-tube and 2-tube transmitters through high school, you occasionally get some wallpaper from official observers. You know, you get a little note from the FCC. They know you're a kid, and they let you off the hook. But I had a lot of fun as a kid, and field day was a lot of fun, too, because, you know, the three of us kids and a bunch of old men kind of described our ham club in town. So we would go out to this farm and we'd do field day, right? And the old men had these nicotine-stained Hallicrafters transceivers and Drake transceivers. They would give to us novices. And, you know, we would send CW and we would get extra points for them. And it was a lot of fun, you know, growing up in that world.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
I would say that my second Elmer was mostly responsible for that. And my second Elmer was Neil Garner, a shop teacher in the high school. By now, I was an old-time ham. I'd been a ham for, 3 or 4 years. And here was this shop teacher that happened to be a double E and a radio guy who had been in the Bay of Pigs type era. The Bay of Pigs built up in the 60s. He had been in the Army. And this guy really wanted to teach college-level electronics in the high school. And he found some willing participants. And at that time, they allowed you to select students for special classes. They don't do that anymore. It's no child left behind. Why do you get special treatment? You can't teach a class on calculus to 7 kids just because they want to learn it. You can't do engineering drafting on 10 kids that want to do engineering drafting and schematics. But at that time, you could.
Right, I remember.
So I got basically a fantastic education in engineering right in high school. And this is the guy that really got me into thinking about college, thinking about electronics as a job. Not as much ham radio. That always stayed a hobby to me. As a matter of fact, all through my career, I have tried to keep a long pole between my professional life and my ham radio life. Sometimes it's hard to do because what I do for work involves the latest SDRs and radio direction finding equipment. And I have to keep all of that well insulated from my love of antique radios and old-time radio.
So do you think that that's the reason that you have kind of stayed with antique and old radio is because it would allow you to keep that space while everything was progressing at light speed during the period of time that you're working?
Yes, a lot to do with that. How can you maintain a hobby that is so close to your work that you can't define the two? So the nostalgia of the old stuff, the nostalgia of the birth of radio and the technology of vacuum tubes, the technology of the hybrid era where we had tubes and transistors together, and the birth of the semiconductors. I tried to keep that era separated from my work, and so far I've been successful at it.
Now, did you get a degree in electronic engineering and an advanced degree?
Right in town, I was able to get my associate's degree in engineering, so that would be a AAS or an EET, I guess you'd call it. There were job offers right after that associate's degree, but we were approached, our class was approached by RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, to come into a brand new program called a Bachelor's of Engineering Technology, a BET, and it's a co-op program, and they grabbed about 10 of us. We were all graduating, and they took us down to Rochester, to RIT, and we became co-op students, and we all became very successful because of that experience. And I was able to co-op at places that would become Harris RF Communications. I was able to secure a job right out of college at Motorola because of that experience.
And what did you do at Motorola?
Well, at Motorola, they didn't quite know what to do with me because I was so odd compared to regular EEs. I had all of this interest in strange electronics. So they put me in the specials group. And the specials group, you would call a systems group today. Basically, we took Motorola radios, handheld radios, different types of paramedic radios, and we would make things out of them. We would make repeaters out of them. We would make different types of two-way radios out of them for like oil rigs and for White House Secret Service. We did all of their equipment. Anything that was oddball or special, you want to put a repeater in a briefcase, we would do that. Anything that was oddball. So it fit right in with the things I like to do.
You're a prolific writer, and when you look at your QRZ page, you've made lots of contributions to magazines like QST, Electric Radio, etc., etc. How did you start to become a writer and a contributor to the hobby in the areas of interest, which is the old-time radios?
I think that when electric radio first came out, I had already been brought into the surplus community through emails and through letter writing at that time. I had already gotten involved with the military collectors groups, like the Old Military Radio Net, OMRN. The Old Military Radio Net still meets Saturday mornings in the AM mode using the surplus equipment at 5 Eastern Standard Time. And they do CW on Sunday evenings at 9 p.m. EST. There was already a lot of interest, so that when electric radio came out, it became a natural. One of my jobs was working at a company called Analog Devices. You might have heard of ADI.
Sure.
I was working as an RF applications engineer, and we were doing some of the most modern chips for the cellular revolution and for cordless telephones and everything you can think of. And I got pulled into another group of people that were very interested in writing. As an applications engineer for ADI, you were expected to be able to write. I was working with people like Walt Jung. Do you know Walter Jung? The IC Timer cookbook?
Yes, yes.
The 555 cookbook? You've heard of Walter Jung.
Sure.
He was somebody I worked with. Have you heard of Barry Gilbert, inventor of the Gilbert cell, the basis for all modern RFICs, the Gilbert cell mixer, and so on? I worked with these people. Paul Brokaw, the Brokaw band gap, which is used in every IC made. It does the temperature stability. So I got writing, and I got doing a lot of schematics for application notes for ADI. And that's what really got me tuned up to start to write, was Analog Devices.
You're writing for Analog Devices, but you have this love of old-time radios. How did starting the articles for, say, Electric Radio and QST start?
Well, there was a guy that I worked with at ADI that was a complete nutty homebrew and project guy. His name was Charles Kitchen, Chuck Kitchen, N1TEV. You've probably heard of Chuck. He's been in QST, and he's been in many other ARRL publications. He's the one that did the High Performance Regenerative Receiver project, and he also did a lot of other projects. But Chuck and I would sit at lunch, and we would just go over schematics, and he's the one that said, "You've got too many parts, Mike. Nobody's going to build anything that's got any more than 10 parts. If you can't make a project for a ham that's less than 10 parts, nobody's going to build it." And he had this philosophy that less was more, simpler was better, and why aren't these hams building things? And that really got me going. And that's how the QST, our first QST article, came about. Chuck and I wrote it together. The other thing I got involved with at that time was called the Antique Wireless Association, the AWA. And these guys were very interested in the history of radio. And I was a member of the AWA for many years. And they had some interesting contests, like the Bruce Kelly 1929 Memorial Contest, which is using CW equipment, which is no newer than 1929 designs. And they have this contest every December. And they have a contest coming up this week, in fact, called the Link Kundal, which is equipment up to about 1960. And again, that's a CW contest. And they have some AM contests and so on. But again, you're using only vintage equipment. So it was right up my alley. And I wrote articles for that magazine as well.
Let me take a quick break here to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast with George, KG6VU, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ. where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. George and Jeremy document their projects and make circuit boards available for sale to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Even if you're a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George and Jeremy for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO today. Now, do you have equipment to allow you to actually participate in the Bruce Kelly 1929 Memorial Contest?
Yes, I have built several transmitters, both Meissner, Hartley, something called a MOPA, a Master Oscillator Power Amplifier, and all of these are built in the style from about 1924 to 1929. Meaning
open chassis on a wooden platter, something like that?
That's right. Some of them are just that. Others are kind of look like a child's chair, and it'll have an upper story and a lower story. The upper story is typically the RF equipment. The lower story is the power supply.
To participate in a contest like this, do you also have to have a vintage receiver in that time period as well?
Well, some people do use homemade receivers. In fact, this week in that contest, I'm using 2 regenerative receivers. But they don't burden you. You can use modern receivers for both of the contests. And it's more about the transmitter because it's very simple to build a Hartley oscillator. You only need a tube and a few parts, and you can get on the air.
So I was looking at your operating position in QRZ, and I noticed that you've got many fine old receivers. With the challenges of electronic noise that probably inflict on most of us who live in urban neighborhoods and other interference factors, how do these radios stand up against some of the newer technology? Have you had a chance to compare?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I have done some shootouts between various equipment. And, starting with the older military equipment, much of that gear is very wide, and it doesn't do well in the modern bands. For instance, I have a receiver from a Lancaster bomber, which is British, and one from a B-17 bomber. And put the two of them against each other and to see the performance. And both of them, do struggle on the modern bands, especially if we have something going on like a contest. It really stresses it. However, the more modern military equipment, such as the Collins R390 and R390A, the 51J3, the 51J4 Collins receivers, and some of the higher-end military sets have no problem whatsoever with the modern bands. In fact, they'll outperform any of these solid-state receivers today.
So when band conditions are really bad and you're operating CW is your digital mode, then you just get on the Collins.
Yes, and you would be surprised what you can do even with small regenerative sets. I mean, I've shown that sometimes a regenerative receiver, when we're in a noisy situation, and I'm talking about atmospheric noise, can grab onto the signal and give you a better signal-to-noise ratio than some of the more modern receivers.
One of the guests I had, and since you're 284, I can't exactly remember which guest it was, said that when the bands seem quiet even at the bottom of the sunspot cycle, it's because everyone's listening and no one's sending CQ. Are you finding that even at the bottom of the sunspot cycle that you are still making contacts?
I make contacts, and I know some people who watch my videos, and I have a video channel called Microwave 1 with a K. They're unbelievers. They think I must have a magic antenna or I'm somehow cheating. But I can assure you that there's a lot of what you're saying that's true. The bands are more open than they've been probably in the past few years, but they're still not the bands that I remember as a young person. That said, we have more tools now. And of course, one of the tools that we have is the proliferation of the SDR sites that you can browse to. And if you want to see if people are listening or not, that's nice. But how about listening to your own signal using one of those sites. And I use this with, say, a one-tube or a one-transistor type transmitter or something like that. If one of those sites can pick up my one-tube or one-transistor, that means that the band is at least open to that site. And it's, as you described, people are just not transmitting enough.
What's interesting to me is, as I go up and down 20 meters, and I have a waterfall display on my ICOM 7300, that what I hear is I hear a lot of CW, and I see the digital modes up 20 kilohertz up from the bottom of the band. And that's it. Maybe there's some single sideband a little bit up, but the band looks very different. But what's interesting is the amount of CW that's actually happening in the band.
Oh, there's a resurgence. There's an absolute resurgence. I actually got to coin a term, and this term was cited in the handbook and in other videos. The term is retro QRP. Retro QRP. What is retro QRP? Basically, people want to use very simple and even nostalgic equipment, like their original novice station, like projects from the 40s and 50s, on the air today. And this has become a trend. You might have heard something about straight key night.
Right.
This is a little thing we do on New Year's Eve. This is becoming popular again. People want to use something analog. And this is akin to the resurgence of analog records, LPs. Why are people interested in LPs when they've discarded 8-tracks and 4-tracks and cassettes and now CDs? Why are they going back? Why do they want to have a tube-type amplifier and a turntable? And we remember those turntables. We had to put pennies on them and tune them endlessly and lubricate them. Why do they want that? And the answer is very simple. People desire something tactile. They desire something that they can feel and that they can sense and that they can hear. You just cannot do that with digital. You need something that's analog.
I think with digital, Mike, I think we've forgotten that our brains are capable of more bandwidth. You know, when you listen to an MP3 versus listening to an LP on a turntable, all of a sudden you realize that your ears can hear from 6 cycles all the way up to 10 kc, right?
Absolutely.
It's like all of a sudden your mind is open once again.
And that's what I think is happening. That's why I think you're seeing the old novice band between 7.1 and 7.15 is becoming popular for slow CW. It's starting to sound again like the early 70s.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? I saw in a picture on your QRZ page that you've got an ARC-5 radio setup in your modern car. How does that work for you, and what kind of attention does that get?
Well, again, that's an example of probably the grotesque. Who puts an ARC-5 system in their car, in their Maxima, and wants to go down the road and try to use 15 watts of AM on 75 meters? You know, it just doesn't make any sense. But, you know, when I'm on long trips, something like that is fun to play with. And I've done some crazy things with ham radio. I mean, I don't know if you've ever tried it, Eric, but have you ever tried CW mobile?
I can hardly drive myself, let alone drive with a key. I'm used to a microphone in my lap.
Okay, well, even handling a microphone can be tricky. But imagine going down the highway and you got your side swiper going and you're sending CW. I used to do crazy things like that. I know in college, my original Elmer, Ed, he was a big 75-meter single sideband guy, so I had to get a single sideband rig for the car, and I ended up with an NCX3 in college. And I'd sit in the parking lot with the Hustler whip and phone patch into my parents. And it was kind of funny talking to your parents on 75 meters from college.
I'm going to ask you a few questions here about this mobile setup of yours because, you know, the ARC-5 is a separate transmitter and receiver and power supply. And that power supply, was that a vibrator power supply or was that a T power supply?
Well, that is not a proper ARC-5 setup like you would have in the aircraft in World War II. That is a highly modified, it is not representative. It is, however, practical. The power supply actually was an old Heathkit solid-state oscillator power supply for one of their transceivers, which I had rewired from an 800-volt voltage doubler to a full-wave bridge, basically having the voltage and doubling the current capacity for AM. And the modulator was actually a pair of FETs in push-pull class B through a low to high hi-fi transformer used as a modulation transformer. So that's a hybrid of technologies, and it's very uncool and very not original, and just something fun to look at and something fun to use.
So if you're driving down the road and you're tuning the receiver with your right hand, when you find a station that you want to call, you actually are also going to have to zero beat the transmitter at the same time?
That's correct. There is a zero switch. You flick the zero switch, and you tune the transmitter's oscillator until you get zero beat, and then you undo it, and then the handheld Shure microphone gives you full transceive capability. The relay for the TR switch clicks. The antenna on the back of the car, which probably I didn't give you a picture of, was basically a Hustler whip antenna tip on top of a 3-foot piece of PVC with some number 10 wire helically wound with a giant mag mount right on the trunk. Probably the worst 75-meter mobile antenna ever conceived. Still able to do AM with little more than 15 or 20 watts out. And people would hear me.
There's a lot of listeners who know keyer paddles, iambic paddles, things like this. I haven't met very many people that use a side swiper. What is a side swiper, and what's the secret to being successful with a side swiper?
Well, that was an example, and I'm not claiming to be able to use some of those early Vibraplex keyers, which are basically they're based on springs and weights, and the weights vibrate back and forth, making the dits and so on. Some of them you make the dash yourself, and only the dits are generated by the vibrating piece of metal against the second contact. I did get a Curtis keyer kit and built that up with the standard iambic type paddles, and I tried to do it, and probably for maybe 10 years I was pretty good at the paddles, but I never was as good at CW as other people. And once you get into the contest mode, everybody uses memories and so on. You know, I worked for a couple of CW experts. I'd call them real expert hams. At Analog Devices, I worked for, as my direct supervisor, Doug Grant, K1DG. And I also worked for his brother-in-law at another company, Cobham Surveillance, John Dorr, K1AR. They're both well-known CW DX experts. I believe that John and both Doug were very involved with CQ Magazine. And they won the Goodwill Games two-man ham radio competition. These are really expert CW guys. And that was a whole other direction of CW for me. That's a whole other world. Me, I like the slow CW with a hand key.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO today. I saw that you have a picture on one of the websites of a Para Set replica that you built. Do you want to explain what a Para Set is and how yours worked out?
Yeah, the Para Set, and I get on tangents, it was something that became popular on the internet in the 90s. And basically, the resistance fighters in France and in the Scandinavian countries especially, during the onset of the war, there was very little equipment that could be sent out. A lot of the spy sets were good-sized suitcase sets, and there just weren't enough of those being built at Bletchley Park by the OSS and later on by the SOE, Special Operations Executive, to be able to drop in both with agents and with resistance fighters. So they needed a low-cost, disposable transmitter-receiver that could be dropped into these countries by parachute or secreted in some other way across the channel. So the Para Set was a kind of a 2-weekend type project at Bletchley, and they actually decided to use a very conservative circuit, a Hartley-type regenerative stage followed by one stage of audio amplification for the receiver, and a one-tube 6V6 oscillator transmitter. The frequency range covered was between about 2 and 8 megahertz, maybe a little higher, and it used crystal control on the transmitter, and again a regenerative receiver. The whole thing fit into a cache box, approximately 8 inches by 7 inches by 3 inches, and it had an associated vibrator power supply, so you could take the wet cell out of your automobile, drag it up to the 3rd floor of a safe house, and run the transmitter receiver without AC means. So it had a few power supply options. It had a main supply as well as a vibra-pack. And this little kit was made by the thousands for use in the occupied countries. I could pick up CW and AM broadcasts. Of course, a regenerative receiver with no isolation on the antenna is not the safest thing to be using. The Germans had sophisticated radio direction finding, both trucks and dismounted type systems, and they were able to hunt down these oscillators in the receivers as well as pick up the transmissions. So many of the agents were captured with these sets. But again, this was a very desperate move early in the war, and if you could get intelligence out of the occupied countries, it was a big win.
So how did you build yours? Did you actually gather up the parts and build it from scratch?
Yes, I built it from scratch. I had the help of a friend who has a machine shop. He's a fantastic help. His name is Spencer Webb, KW2S, now W2SW, and he has a company called Antennasis. But he's a one-man show, and he's got, the 3D modeling machines, and he's got the sheet metal. He's a real machinist, and he's got the multi-axis milling machines and so on. And we built up the Para Set parts. Later on, I found out that they were selling the parts, and you could actually buy them.
Already pre-drilled and everything.
Yeah, getting the thing, the chassis pre-drilled and all of that, that's a big deal to that project. Otherwise, it took me about a year to collect all the parts. I found the instructions on the internet. Some of these are original from World War II. There's many websites devoted to the Para Set. Fun little project, and I can say it works beautifully. My most exciting contact with the Para Set, it puts out about 4 or 5 watts on 40 meters and about 5 or 6 watts on 80 meters. I was just getting it going. uses two flashlight bulbs to tune to the antenna. So you're loading RF into the antenna because you're making these flashlight bulbs light up. It's very practical. And I put a rock in there, 3.507, right down at the bottom of the extra part of 80 meters, and made a bold CQ right in the middle of the DX band with the Para Set. And I got a call back from a DK station, and the DK station was German. And when I said what I was using, I thought he was going to lose it, because he was actually a war veteran, and he was in the Wehrmacht in World War II in one of those radio vans. His target was the Para Set.
I guess it was meant to be.
It was really something. This is using nothing but a dipole and the Para Set doing across the pond QSO on CW.
What's the QTH now?
I'm in Manchester, New Hampshire, which is located in the south-central part of the state. It's about an hour north of Boston.
Okay, so you're close to the water.
Yeah, so we have a big advantage here with DX to Europe, that's for sure.
It's my understanding that you also work VLF, very low frequencies.
Again, I get on tangents of interest. I mean, I got into slow scan television for a while. I got into digital modes for a while using the old equipment, which is really crazy. Yeah, a computer and a World War II receiver, you're trying to do digital. It's nuts. But, VLF, I got so interested in the low frequencies that I actually had a beacon on the air. And this is the Part 15, 160 to 190 kilohertz band. It's a Part 15 band where you don't need a license, and you're limited to 1 watt input power, at least at that time. And I made a transmitter and put it in an ice chest, put up an antenna in the woods, and went through that whole thing so that I was actually a beacon station for a while here in New England. Later on, I got involved with trying to listen to these beacons, and now we have a licensed band down there, and I do have permission to transmit down there from the Power Authority. You have to have a written or by email approval of the Power Authority to actually go on the air down there legally in the 1750 meter and the band that's located around 500 kilohertz.
Why would the Power Authority have jurisdiction over the band down there? What are they doing down there?
They use frequencies in the VLF spectrum to do their automatic switching, the switching that's done to control the power on the high voltage lines. And they use a type of spread spectrum down there on the power line to control the lines. And they were simply afraid that the FCC allowing hams to have these low frequencies would somehow interfere with those lines. It's not that they wanted to stop the hams, it's that they wanted to have a say in it in case there was some interference.
What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now, from your perspective?
I think that we've gotten over the hump. There was some very, very negative times where ham radio had become so outdated, so made fun of with the internet revolution, especially between 1990 and the mid 2000, 2005, that era, that things were not looking good for ham radio. But I think that there's been a resurgence in the nostalgia of ham radio and getting on the air and getting away from your screen. And then we also have to talk about what's going on with digital. That's certainly helped ham radio come back. You have to admit that the digital modes have helped to make a resurgence. So I think we're over the hump now, Eric.
Well, I think that's good to know. So then what excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
I think that people wanting to relive their novice years, wanting to restore the old equipment rather than scrap it, wanting to build some of the traditional gear is causing a lot of excitement for me. The interest in my videos, which are almost exclusively showing simple projects and old-time radio projects and restoration of radios and military surplus are getting more popular all the time.
And are there still sources for military surplus radios? I kind of remember the surplus years, in the 60s and 70s when you could go into these yards and find all kind of stuff. But can you find stuff now?
Well, it ended. Certainly by the time I was a young ham, the surplus era had pretty much ended. So even by the early 70s, the days of Radio Row in New York and Goodhart Electronics and Meshna Electronics in Boston, and even Fair Radio Sales in Lima, Ohio, the seemingly endless supply of World War II surplus equipment had pretty much been expended. And it was all either scrapped or it was in the hands of the hams. So where do you find it today? You find it at Hamfests. You find it on eBay. It's out there.
Estate sales, perhaps.
Absolutely. I got most of my early surplus stations here in New England at estate sales. That's true.
So there's no shortage of the stuff. It's going to recirculate again. And with YouTube sites like yours and other resources, what's the best, perhaps besides electric radio, what are the magazines that you read in order to keep up to date? And do you have any favorite websites?
Well, I don't really have much to say about that other than electric radio and the Antique Wireless Association Journal and their periodical that they put out each year. That's where most of the action is. Another forum that works out quite well is the AM forum, the AMers. And, of course, we all made fun of the AMers. We all made fun of the AMers in the 70s because they refused to change from AM to single sideband, and these guys just want to use AM. And it became kind of a niche thing. Then it became popular because of the audio broadcast quality, and you had a lot of audio guys getting involved with AM. Those guys tend to have a wealth of knowledge, not only with AM, but with surplus equipment as well.
Right, especially what small broadcast transmitters that they use on 80 meters, for example, as AM stations around the country are being shut down.
That's true. And now that the FCC is allowing more and more small AM stations to community radio and so on.
Really?
I think that's feeding into it, too.
Is that right? Are AM stations coming back at the community level?
I think we're going to start to see more of it. Most of that community stuff has been on the FM band because it's easier to regulate, but I think they're going to start loosening up on AM as well.
Well, do you think that would create a resurgence of, say, broadcast receivers? I mean, you start to think that, like across Europe, AM and FM stations are being taken off the air for LTE, people just taking it over the internet. Do you see a resurgence of commercial broadcast or community broadcast, kind of going back to the old technology?
This is different than Europe. In the United States, we have a sense of nostalgia for electronics that you do not see over there. And the ability to simply take over frequencies. While it seems like it's easy, especially at the higher frequencies with cellular and the 5G and so on, when you have these traditional bands like the AM and the FM and even the TV band, those are fighting words, and people really tend to want to hold on to their frequencies. With the advent of talk radio and both liberal and conservative talk shows, that really saved AM. And there's a very strong lobby to keep AM intact. The FCC is willing to talk to people that can use certified equipment on these Part 15 type transmitters. Pirate stations and so on, they happen, but you're going to see that 99% of this is in the FM band. There's really not much going on in the AM band as far as pirate stuff goes on.
Well, I actually think that's kind of new and refreshing. As a kid that grew up listening to AM radio, it was exciting, especially in the middle of the night when the band would open up and all of a sudden you're hearing AM stations thousands of miles away.
It's a lot, big excitement. You've got your crystal set or your one transistor regen, and you're listening. This is the stuff of legends.
It was the stuff of dreams. Absolutely, this is true. What advice would you give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
Don't be afraid to relive your childhood. There is nothing wrong at all to seek out your original station, to go out and find that DX40 or the DX60 or the Lafayette.
Or the HW16.
Get a hold of it, and you will have the same joy that you had as a child.
Mike, I think that's amazing advice. It's so refreshing to actually hear that this stuff is coming back. It was fun in its day, and it can be fun now. So I really appreciate your coming on the QSO Today podcast and helping us relive the memory. It sounds to me like you're reliving the memory every day. With that, I want to thank you so much for joining me on QSO Today and wish you 73.
Okay, Eric. Well, thank you so much for having me, and let's get out there and let's build something.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Mike. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in WU2D in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support for these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages or by using QSO Today in the coupon box at the checkout. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor, monthly or annually, by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 300. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." Special thanks to Ben Bresky, who now edits the audio for this QSO Today podcast from the audio pieces that I give him. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.